Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We've helped life science companies from across the globe over the past 13 years do everything from creating virtual advisory boards, steering committees, investigator groups, medical education. And since the launch of our Insight Events platform, we've also helped companies with their sales training events, hackathons, medical science liaison training events, and everything in between. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, the pharma leaders, the digital provocateurs, we can all work to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. But it doesn't just stop there. We can't just start a conversation. We need to sustain the conversation. This is precisely the reason we do this, and we have the online platform that we do, so that we can bring stakeholders together to be able to push agendas forward, to build objectives, to create policy change, and to create real work. So I'm really excited to be able to have one of these thought leaders in the healthcare space with me today. And this is actually Sabrina Hanna. Sabrina is the founder and managing director and the CIO of the Cancer Collaborative. This is a Canadian not-for-profit designed to bridge science, policy, and advocacy all together in order to make a meaningful contribution to cancer care. And as we've always said, positively impact patient outcomes. So Sabrina has served as a member of several patient advisory and steering committees, our specialty, of course, including for Innovative Medicines Canada. She's also worked with the Global Melanoma Coalition, Colorectal Cancer Canada, as well as many others. Sabrina has graduated from Concordia University in Montreal with a Bachelor's of Science in Exercise Science, and she has a certificate in public relations. Sabrina began her professional career working in research at the Jewish General Hospital, and she has dedicated her career to the nonprofit sector. Welcome, Sabrina. So happy to have you on the show.
Thank you, Natalie. It's so great to be on here and having this discussion with you today.
Absolutely. I love the work that you're doing with what you're doing at Cancer Collaborative. I'm just curious about the interesting trajectory that you've had from everything from being in research and PR, and then kind of landing yourself in the kind of not-for-profit. How did you find yourself there? And secondly, how did you end up finding or basically managing or finding yourself as the managing director of this really important nonprofit?
Yeah, so, it's funny, somebody asked me just last week what I studied to be doing what I'm doing. And a lot of people who work in advocacy don't actually come to it by education. And so, as you mentioned, I graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Exercise Science. My first job out of university was as a research assistant on a study to see the effectiveness of exercise on patients waiting to undergo hip replacement surgery. So I was the person who would go meet the patients with my exercise science background. I would go meet the patients, do the testing, and prescribe the exercises based on their own personal limitations. And so this was early 2000. And so I would do the baseline testing with them, and then I would meet with them again at 3 and 6 months. And the idea was that exercise could potentially delay or eliminate the need to have hip replacement surgery. So finally, our funding ran out. All the patients ended up having to have surgery, but all of them went into surgery with reduced pain and recovered better from their hip replacement surgery. And I think that experience really set me up for what I'm doing now. I got into the advocacy space and it was like, oh yeah, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is how the PR and the science background and everything just works really well together in doing this work. And when I started, I was working in melanoma, and it was just such a great fit. But I think the majority of people who go into the health sciences are generally there to be of service to others. So for me, not-for-profit was just a natural fit. But coming back to the question about the Cancer Collaborative, as you said, It's a not-for-profit think tank dedicated to bridging science, policy, and advocacy, and essentially using science or data to create actionable advocacy that can shape policy. And it really goes back to that idea that you said about having those conversations and then having an agenda to actually take that conversation out of just that dialogue platform. So being as that I'm not a doctor or a patient or a peer, we facilitate that cross-sector collaboration and then build those partnerships with stakeholders across the continuum to build that knowledge and then share it to support informed decision-making and then create that meaningful action-oriented change to improve patient outcomes.
I love it, and so well described, Sabrina. I love the way sometimes serendipitously the factors around us bring us into the journey that we're in, and yours was so eloquently articulated. You talked really importantly, because again, the work that you do is hard. It's sometimes can feel like watching a glacier melt. It can sometimes be that painfully slow. It's tough, hard work. You mentioned the idea of partnerships, and there's a whole slew of cancer organizations across the country. Some of the ones I'm thinking about are, some other ones that I'm just thinking here about other associations that are specifically cancer oriented. I think that there's one that Eva Villalba runs, as well as there's there's nurse navigators that like drug access, and a whole series, Lung Cancer Canada, and on it goes. How do you find that the Cancer Collaborative works in collaboration with these other associations so that the voice is heard and that you can move this glacier a little faster?
Yeah, it is definitely painstakingly slow. So I think with the Cancer Collaborative, I don't do any patient advocacy. I am not a patient advocate. We really work on the other side of things. So we are really there to support and work with the healthcare professionals and the patient advocacy groups. So for example, Eva works with Coalition Priorité Cancer Québec, and we're not really doing anything Quebec specific, but in CAR-T, for example, where it's a national problem, we are working with, I, as the Cancer Collaborative, has set up a co-laboratory with some of the other patient groups, and we're working together. So the idea initially was to build the central repository with all the information about CAR-T, how to access it across Canada, all the information that patients need, the information that healthcare professionals need in like this one place. But that really has developed into more of an advocacy platform, and we're working together now to work on the current advocacy issues that we're having with CAR-T. So I think, like I said, it's not a patient group. We don't work with patients. We don't do that. Our stakeholders really include industry, regulators, HTA, pricing agencies, basically anybody who's willing to listen to us or come and have a conversation with us. We'll bring them in.
I love it. A lot of discussion for a long, long time, Sabrina, on this whole case around personalized medicine. We've been hearing this a lot. I think since COVID-19, this has become very much of a reality in the day-to-day lives of everybody, including patients, and certainly in the hearts and minds of HTA and healthcare providers. Can you actually explain from your perspective what the importance of this is, and what is really ultimately the difference between personalized and precision medicine?
That is a great question. So I think that there is a lot of debate between personalized and precision. In Europe, they're still using personalized. In Canada, the US, we're definitely using precision medicine. I mean, I think that we even need to have a definition for what precision medicine, precision oncology is, because there's no real standard definition of any of these things. So I think personalized medicine is the more larger overreaching area, and precision medicine is really like the tools that we're using to be personalized in the way that we're approaching medicine.
I actually really like that definition. We'll have to write that one down. I think that's terrific. And on a similar note, there is, oncology and quite frankly, rare diseases. It's such an abstraction, and it's like, again, when we talk about glaciers moving, I mean, it's certainly one of these diseases that has been studied for years and years, and certainly there's been a confluence over the past 10 to 15 years, and we're now starting to see the effects of the research and all these new drugs and biologics and what have you coming down the pipe. But the essence is that they're still really, really tough. I mean, these are really difficult therapeutic area to really get under. And part of this has to also do with issues around diagnosis and what this means and how do we find this. But more importantly, these drugs are expensive. We're always balking at the cost of drugs, and rare diseases and oncology products always come up as these examples of why we cannot afford healthcare. So the importance of needing to determine surrogates and biomarkers. How would you sort of fit in your description or where your stance is or the policy that you want to drive towards in regards to how cancers are diagnosed and specifically the use of biomarkers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question, because I think the whole premise of precision medicine came about with more use of next generation sequencing, right? And so, there's been a lot of debate about the surrogates, at ASCO, especially talking about what are like the real endpoints that we really should be looking at. And I think that's a really great question to be asking, because is overall survival really the most important thing when it comes to these therapies? And if you're asking a decision maker, maybe yes, that's what's the most important. When you're asking industry, that might be the most important too. But if you're talking to a patient, they're thinking about quality of life. They're thinking about, can they go to work? Can they take care of their families? Are they able to have relationships with their partners, with their families, with their friends? Are they able to do the things that they would normally be able to do without cancer? And so I think that question on surrogates is really interesting. And I think, when we're talking about policy and policy change, we really need to be asking those questions too. But just to go back to biomarkers, I think, the way that we are treating cancer now, and we're still really at the infancy of precision medicine, but the way that we're treating cancer now is so different than how it was being treated even 5 years ago. And, like lung cancer, for example, is one disease, but it's actually 12 different diseases. So I think the biomarkers is really important, and thinking even just a little further ahead, and probably something we don't even want to talk about right now today. We definitely don't want to, but thinking about how is that going to change the care landscape. Are medical oncologists going to be treating by tumor site, or are they going to be treating by the characteristics of the tumor? And then, and the same applies to patient groups. Are there going to be like lung cancer and colorectal cancer and myeloma patient groups, or are they going to be mutation specific patient groups? So it's a really interesting question.
I'm just throwing this out just to the relationship recently of the renaming by WHO of the variants of COVID-19, giving them new names. And so it's interesting that the names of diseases and therapeutic areas could actually be renamed in the future. So it's a semantics game and it's a mindset game. And I think it's really interesting, some of the things that you posed. And on that dialogue also comes the question, as we speak about precision and personalized medicine, is the advent of genetics and genomics. Right now in the cancer space, specifically in Canada, there's an incredible shortage of genetic counselors and genetic testing. And what does this mean? And people are waiting up as long as 5 years for this. But genetics is such an incredible piece of the diagnosis. In fact, not dealing with sickness care, but a proactive wellness care, being able to be predictive of potential issues, of potential mutations, of things that may result in some sort of a cancer. What is the stance of the Cancer Collaborative on this discussion of where genetics fits And why is it different than genomic testing?
Yeah, so I think when we're looking at next generation sequencing, we're really looking at genomic testing. And I think genetic is really when it comes down to, if if it's somatic or if it's germline, is it inherited? Like, I think that that's a completely different ball game, and it's probably much bigger and less known as the genomics aspect. I think the genomics aspect is really the important thing that we're looking at when we're talking about next generation sequencing and treating patients based on the mutations that are in the cancer. I hope I didn't screw those two up. I'm pretty sure it's based on the genomics.
Yeah, and it's a real, like, honestly, that's a whole other show. It's a whole other week of
Yeah.
discussion. It's a lifetime of discussion. It's just opening the doors to incredible possibilities. And I think the thing that's really interesting, I mean, we just heard an announcement from 23andMe, which is, is sort of the consumer version of genetic testing. And you go in and you do a saliva swab and you find out things about yourself and you get reports. They're actually going through a big purchase, like a SPAC. It's almost like an IPO. They're getting larger, they're getting recognized, and they're doing studies all the time. And they just determined recently some factors associated with people who might be more susceptible to COVID-19.
Yeah.
So this incredible opportunity of being able to do population health management, if you get a large enough cohort of people, potentially one day in the future, from the time when somebody is born, that they have their whole genome tested, and then having baseline associated with your own levels, which would be very interesting, of the new future of the N=1 health management. Yeah. So it does beg the question about molecular profiling and, what your stance is around the whole, I guess, arena around liquid biopsies and providing these things more in the hands of the patient, being able to do them at home and not have to go to a lab, and being able to be proactive, almost like a biohacker, to go in and find out information about yourself. How is the Cancer Collaborative helping with that conversation?
Yeah, so I don't think that we're really in the space where we're going to be talking about, doing these liquid biopsies at home and taking that sort of larger perspective on the genetic and genomic testing. I think, though, that the biopsies, and if we're looking at COVID-19 and how that's shifted the way that clinical trials are done now, because they've had to sort of reassess that whole process and making sure that patients are coming in only if they absolutely need to. So they're doing a lot of stuff at home. They're like, they could do the saliva swabs and send them in. They could do the consent forms online or by telephone. So that, I think that is an important aspect, like that at home and not having to bring the patients into the hospital or the clinic if not necessary. But I think with the liquid biopsies, and this is maybe going on a tangent, but at ASCO just a few years ago, there was a session on biopsies, and FDA approved the first liquid biopsy last year. But in this session at ASCO, and I believe it was just a couple of years ago, they were talking about the different biopsies, and they were talking about saliva biopsies and breath biopsies and the liquid biopsies. And I mean, I just think if somebody can, do this breath biopsy and be diagnosed with lung cancer at stage 1 or 2, how does that change the whole landscape for lung cancer? It's a completely different ballgame now, because patients are getting diagnosed, it's metastatic, it's advanced, the overall survival is really low in lung cancer. But imagine having this breath test where you can, I mean, I don't know how it would work. You blow into something and then you could potentially be diagnosed with stage 1 or stage 2, and then the intervention and the outlook is so different.
Absolutely. We're just starting to see the advent of artificial intelligence coming into all of this with smart algorithms. Not that they're going to necessarily take over from diagnosticians or physicians, but they're going to potentially act like a triage, so that we can actually be really smart with a focus on people that are going to have an actual diagnosis and not plug up the hospital environment where all the potential costs come in. So that's going to be very interesting. You bring up a very important point, Sabrina, around decentralized clinical trials. COVID-19 has illuminated that. There's been an immense transformation in the pharmaceutical space because there's been almost like an immediate halt, and then people have had to pivot with new endpoints, with new trial study points, and going back to IRBs for some people. And there's just been this immediate need for, like you were saying, everything from e-consent to PROs to ECOAs and all kinds of other formulations of how information is going to get extracted. What have you seen has been some of the immediate advantages around things like clinical trial recruitment and other items? But what has also been some of the pushback in terms of getting more decentralized or potentially hybrid trials out in the market for oncology?
Yeah, well, I'm not really super familiar with, the clinical trial space. I think that comes a long way before we're having to deal with the issues. I do think that the AI, the deep learning, the machine learning, all that is going to influence the way that clinicians are working. How is that going to play into clinical trials? I don't really know. I think an important aspect in clinical trials, though, is incorporating the patient voice. And I don't know if you're ready to go into that topic, but I think, when it comes to clinical trials, I think if we're asking the right questions and asking patients what they're really needing, what their unmet needs are, then that can really change clinical trials.
In a huge way. And I think clinical trials, I think we're really on the precipice of some very exciting things. Everything from, like you were saying, is reported outcomes, the use of wearable technologies. Yeah. And in someday, there's just going to be this ambient biometrics where people are just churning out data constantly. And it's going to be a very exciting and potentially scary world as we start to go through policy change and regulations. But all of this stuff to say that data is being accumulated in a very rapid way. We hear it in all kinds of ways, everything from data lakes to real world, we hear it as the real world data or real world evidence, and then even things like patient registries. Mm-hmm. I'm curious as to the stance that the Cancer Collaborative has on how and where you're going to use this data, and can it be used for clinical discovery, innovation, and what are the voices saying around this data?
Yeah, I think that this is such an important topic. I mean, just, to touch really quickly on wearables. I mean, everybody's got a wearable now. I'm sure everybody listening has got one. I've got one. And I mean, if you think about, Apple has announced, or actually they haven't announced, but there's a leak that there's going to be a continuous glucose monitor on the next Apple Watch. And if you think about what continuous glucose monitors have done in the diabetic world, where, now they're having this real-time monitoring of their symptoms instead of having to, prick their finger and then read every hour or 2 hours and see how they're managing their insulin or their glucose. Continuous glucose monitors have really changed the landscape for diabetes. But now what we're seeing, and this is exciting as an exercise scientist, is that continuous glucose monitors can really help people change their metabolic health. And that can change the other pandemic that nobody talks about, which is obesity, right? And so, if we're looking at wearables, there's so much data that can be collected from that, and that can be used to really transform healthcare. And I think, to Ethan Bosch, who had a plenary at ASCO, I think it was in 2017, who had started the conversation on self-reported patient outcomes, and seeing that overall survival had increased just by doing self-reported patient outcomes. So, how that plays into cancer, I'm not entirely sure. As the Cancer Collaborative, we're definitely looking at that. We're looking at how real-world evidence, real-world data can shape policy. We're looking at how it can influence the discussions before they're being had on drug discovery, It's such an important topic. There's so much information that can be gleaned from that data. And, like even the basic stuff, like, imagine being able to map return to work for Canadians who have cancer, and how, let's say, for example, the patients who are getting precision medicine, and being able to map that return to work, and then using that to shape policy and to change the landscape for patients. I think that there's so it's gold,
Absolutely. It's such an exciting area that you're in, Sabrina, and I'm sure that there's never a boring moment. Every day there's something new. You bring up something so immensely important, which is we talked about patient centricity for years, but as I was alluding to earlier, it's real now. It's happening, and it's more important than it ever has been before. The FDA released the 21st Centuries Act in 2017, which basically really highly suggested that patients get involved in clinical trials as early as the time to consideration of how they're even created. So I'm just curious, when you're thinking from the lens of the patient, the caregiver, the advocate, the average citizen, the Canadian citizen, with really important components like intervention outcomes, the effectiveness markers, things like we've used traditionally, like time to event, first date of treatment, overall survival, progression, these sort of standardized legacy clinical endpoints. How are we, or how should we be considering things are new? I know we talked a little earlier about biomarkers and surrogates, but how can patients and their version of it come into play, and helping to push organizations like, again, Canada's like an HDA country. We have CADIC, we have INIS, we have various other people that we collaborate, but what should we be thinking about when we're talking about these types of endpoints?
Yeah, I mean, I think patient centricity is such an important aspect in the conversation, and not just in drug delivery, or drug discovery, but really throughout the cancer care delivery. And I think, if we're really asking the right questions, we should be asking, what do patients need? What is going to be meaningful drug that is going to impact patients? And we're just not doing that now. So I think that if we started having those conversations, we would be able to identify, like, what are the appropriate surrogates in clinical trials? What are the appropriate surrogates in making decisions about reimbursement and, approval at Health Canada and at the HTA level? So, we're not doing that yet. We're so far from doing that. So what are the right surrogates? I don't know. I think we'd have to ask the patients. I mean, it depends too, right? On like, what is their disease? Is it, if it's lung cancer, it might be different than melanoma, might be different than colorectal. So I really think that that's an important question to be asking. I do think, since we're talking about patient centricity, I think that there's a lot of terms that are being used interchangeably, and it's patient involvement, patient engagement, patient partnerships, but none of that actually means that we're being patient-centric. And if we're going to be patient-centric, then our organization and our business decisions need to be based on the patient, and the patient needs to be at the core of all of those decisions. And that's not what we're seeing now. Drug discovery is not done with the patient at the core. Reimbursement decisions are not being done with the patient at the core. Review and approval is not being done with the patient at the core. So I think that before we can even sort of determine what those surrogates are, we really need to truthfully define how we're working, engaging, partnering with the patients and the patient advocates.
So right now, when we talk about some of these organizations, these are regulators, these are researchers, they're pricing agencies, a whole series, and obviously every country, and specifically HTA countries, have a very specific methodology and flow before something is approved, and it can take quite a bit of time. Now, in this is a lot of decisions around, how they determine resource use. For example, how many drugs, hospitalizations, how they interpret direct costs versus indirect costs. There's also a lot of things called PROMs, or basically these are patient-reported outcomes. And then there's PREMs, which are patient-related experience outcomes. So with that said, there's a lot of legacy. When we say legacy, there's an infrastructure. And you hear this a lot when people from these heavy, scaffolded units or organizations speak. It's like, point whatever agenda item, so everything is very formalized and very old school. Mm-hmm. It is really difficult to break down that scaffolding. Is there an opportunity to start something completely new? Or is the idea behind this sort of complex reimagination and rejuvenation to try to dismantle what's there and then try to rebuild it? How do we re-look at some of these legacy thinking, the legacy methodology, and get people to really think outside of the box?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a question I have been asking for the last 7 years. And I haven't come up with an answer yet, but I'm working on, how do we connect the dots and have that discussion and bring all those pieces together. So, if we're thinking about, and I'm going to be repeating myself because I think it's so important, it's, if we're asking the right questions right at the beginning, so we're asking patients, what do you need? Like, what is going to make the most impact in your life today in terms of cancer therapy? And maybe what they need is, a drug that it has less side effects, or, I don't know what it is, so I won't pretend. But if we're asking that question at the beginning, then we're going to have more successful clinical trials. And then if we're having successful clinical trials, we're getting faster approval. So, I don't know, is it the chicken or the egg, right? So if we're bringing the patients in right at the beginning, how does that change the drug development landscape? And, from drug development up until reimbursement and access, how does it change? Is it going to make an impact? I personally think that it will. Apparently, pharma and decision makers and government organizations don't agree with me. So it's really about, trying to make them see how things could be different, having those conversations, those preliminary conversations.
COVID-19 has just completely blown the doors off a lot of people's thinking. We talked earlier about clinical trials literally stopping. And as we all know, only 11% of clinical trials actually ever get fully recruited. And that also, corresponds to oncology drugs. But obviously, there's just been this big shockwave that went through because people were not prepared to have patient-reported outcomes from remote locations. So the question comes down to is, how are we, going to be including the patient voice in a much more robust way, and getting people to start deliberating and getting them included in a real way through these sort of clinical reports. I know this is something that CADIF, as an HDA organization, has included as part of the process. So there is actually a clinical review process, and patients, as well as physicians and any other interested stakeholders, can participate in these conversations. It's one thing to say that you're participating, it's a whole other thing to measure the impact. What has been the success in Canada so far, if you were to do a scorecard? And what kinds of recommendations would you make to the HTA organizations that we work with to try to push the envelope on the actual influence that patients have on the decision-making that's happening?
Yeah, I think it's not a straight answer, because it really depends on the quality of the information that's coming from the patient advocacy or the patient groups, right? So I think, and CADIF did a really great job of this just a few years back. They had a workshop with some patient advocates, and it's really unfortunate that there weren't more patient advocates there, because it was really transformative for me as a patient advocate. And so they had this workshop where they sort of went through all the different frameworks that they're evaluating when they're doing a review for therapy. And then they had us go out into groups, and then we each had a case study, and we were the HTA, and we had to decide if we were going to approve, not approve, or approve with conditions. And I thought that that was so wonderful, because it really showed that it's not just about the patient experience. It's really about providing patient experience that is relevant to the stakeholder or to HTA to make the decision of whether this is a therapy or an intervention that is going to be that is going to make an impact in patients' lives. I mean, like how Canada in their HTA is doing evaluating patients' admissions now. I mean, I think we could do better. I think we're probably, one of the better ones if we're looking at what's happening in Europe, if we're looking at, everywhere else. People could probably learn from what is happening here, but of course there's always space for improvement. And I think that it really comes down to, what is the information that is being provided from the patient advocacy groups as well.
But you're also seeing organizations like the PMPRB and the recent, I guess, altercation with some of the rare disease organizations, and kind of a bit of a standoff, and who should be doing what and what's certain jurisdictions. So this is just a great example of legacy infrastructure that's impenetrable. And that makes it a very discouraging, if you will, backpedaling for organizations like yourselves. How are you leveraging those recent episodes for how you will be handling things for oncology products?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's happening with PMPRB is really frustrating for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. Again, like as you said, it's a lot of legacy, it's a lot of bureaucracy, and it really has nothing to do with the patient, which is unfortunate. I think from the Cancer Collaborative perspective, we're not actually working on PMPRB because there are so many other groups who are doing that. So from our perspective, it's really about showing the value of a therapy and then working with the stakeholders to, make sure that the decision makers are understanding. They're not scientists. They didn't graduate with a BSc in any sort of, way that we give them qualifications to understand what is actually happening scientifically. And it's not their fault. They're politicians. They're bureaucrats. So I think from our perspective, it's really important to show the value and to help them think beyond the cost. And if we're talking about CAR T, for example, if we're looking at immunotherapies or precision medicine or immunotherapies, for example, there's 20, 30, or 40% response rate. If we're looking at CAR T, it's like 83% and above. It's a one-time infusion. There are less adverse events than stem cell transplant. It costs less than stem cell transplant, but it's a disruptive intervention. So, for CAR T, it's really about showing the cost benefit, the cost effectiveness of CAR T. So, for the Cancer Collaborative, that's how we're looking at things. I mean, obviously, what's happening with PMPRB is going to affect what therapies are going to be accessible in Canada and the clinical trials. So, that's worrisome, but it's not in our scope at the moment.
And in the same, on the similar vein, a lot of the national dialogue happening around the PharmaCare, a national PharmaCare program. So you're either in or you're out. It's sort of like a black and white inclusion or exclusion. Lots of concern, lots of fear. The COVID-19 is certainly, a lot of people have been leveraging this as an example that if you don't stay on top of it, if you don't, that you're going to be excluded, and then we end up scrambling for important drugs. Now, what's happened also at the same time with COVID-19 is there's been almost like a ignoring, if you will, of cancer diagnosis?
Mhm.
Is there going to be a large bolus coming up, or did we just miss people? So it's brought up an important dialogue that we're not manufacturers of vaccines. Can we also be asking the same question if we're not being innovative? If we are slapping in these PMPRB regulations, if we're putting in these black and white pharmacare programs where the average citizen isn't aware that there's certain drugs they won't ever have access to. How have you leveraged these ideas to try to push the agenda forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to the idea that, you know, if we're not paying for innovation now, we're going to pay for it down the line and it's going to cost us more. So it really, you know, when you're talking to decision makers and payers, you really have to talk about the economics of things. And, you know, the economics of giving a melanoma patient chemotherapy, while it's really inexpensive to give chemotherapy versus an immunotherapy, makes no sense. Makes no business sense. It makes no sense for the patient either. So I think it's really about having those conversations and you know, connecting the dots.
Yeah, 100%. You brought up a really important thing, which is probably some of the very exciting things going to be discussed at ASCO this year around CAR T therapy, immuno-oncology. But at the same time, we're hearing a lot on the other side about biosimilars.
Yeah.
Where do we sit on this discussion, and what is going to make the most sense from the sort of cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so just starting a little backwards. So we'll start with biosimilars. I think there has been so much data on biosimilars in oncology. Europe has been doing it for, I don't know, upwards of 10 years now. And I mean, if it's if it's not enough evidence, you know, and everybody is evidence-based now, that all that evidence is out there. So, you know, I think we really need to be implementing biosimilars appropriately, you know, taking the physician and patient preference into consideration, but really utilizing biosimilars so that we can capitalize on those innovations in immunotherapy, in CAR T, in, you know, in precision medicine and everything that's going on in oncology, and using those resources that we're saving with the use of biosimilars to be able to have access to those. And then looking at immunotherapies, you know, we're really just at the cusp of immuno-oncology, and you know, we've really only had experience with immune checkpoint inhibitors. And you know, if we're looking at melanoma, for example, where overall response was 0 with chemotherapy or close to 0, and then with the CTLA4 we had 20% response, and then with the PDL1s, there was a 35 or approximately 35% response. And then with the CTLA4 and the PDL1, there was 50% response, which is super exciting. But there's still 50% of people who are diagnosed with metastatic melanoma who, you know, IO is not going to be responsive to. So I think, you know, there's so much research being done in immunotherapy now, and it's going to be interesting to see how our pricing and regulating and reimbursement and paying agencies are going to deal with all that innovation when it comes down the line. And, you know, when we're looking at immunotherapies, it's not just immune checkpoint inhibitors. It's going to be immune checkpoint inhibitors with immune checkpoint stimulators, with radiation, with chemotherapy, with oncolytic viruses. So it's going to be a really interesting landscape when that happens. And you know, we're not that far off. You know, there's a lot of studies that are phase 2 now. And you know, it's going to be a few years before it's phase 3, and then before they're coming in for market access. And obviously, not everything is going to you know, make it past the clinical trial stage, but there's a lot happening in that area right now.
Absolutely. And I think the more data that payers will have on the evaluation, risk mitigation, gain sharing, all of these kinds of things are going to be part of that equation. And I'm certain that the use of AI to do deep data mining and really finding out where the cohorts are or what's going to work with who, and really doing that uber customized treatment is probably going to be part of this. Because like you were saying, there's going to be no end in sight into the combinations and the intrinsic cost that that's going to entail as we start stacking drugs. So I think the other thing that's really important here is really because of all of this, there's going to be a requirement for advocacy, advocating everything that you've already been discussing in this past hour. What is your organization doing to try to build better advocacy, and how are you partnering with Pharma on that?
Yeah, so I think, there's a responsibility for all the stakeholders to build better patient advocates. And I gave the example of the workshop that Kat did. I think that is a great example of building better patient advocates. At the Cancer Collaborative, I go to ASCO every year. There are a handful of Canadian patient advocates that attend. There are some medical oncologists, hematologists, pathologists who attend as well. But, is Health Canada there? Is HTA there? Are decision makers there? Are payers there? Cancer agencies? There's nobody from those organizations that are there. So, and I started this just a few years ago, but every time I go to ASCO, I write a report and I highlight, in plain language, from my perspective, these are the things that we need to keep on our radar. These are the things we need to start talking about. These are the things that you should know about. And, these are 50-page reports. They take me days and days and days of nonstop work to put together. But I think it's important, and I share them with the cancer agencies, with the ministries of health, with the patient groups, with industry, I share it with everybody. And I think that's like just one step in building better advocates, but I think it's really everybody's responsibility. It's industry, it's the patient advocates. We need to work together. We need to be more collaborative. We need to share insights. We need to share experience. We need to share knowledge, and we need to be able to take all that and then to be able to use it into building effective advocacy for the patients that everybody's representing.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of work and amazing work in getting that conversation going, but it does actually beg the question of an analogy I oftentimes like to use, because I do a lot of hiking. And I love seeing what the forest has, and not specifically as dramatic as a forest fire, but just the way a forest works. There's actually a lot of greenery growing from the bottom, and there's a lot of beautiful, great, majestic trees. And then there's some that are just dead, and then they kind of fall on the other ones and they just land on the ground. It kind of makes me think in some ways about some of these legacy structures, policies, and things. And I'm not trying to get political here, but it does make one wonder about some of the infrastructure in the Canadian government as it compares to so many other governmental agencies, and even just what I would call the global scorecard of how COVID-19, for example, was managed. We sort of played catch up, but there didn't seem to be a lot of sort of forward leadership, and there was a lot of behind the scenes of just trying to follow what everybody else was doing and catching up. Is there some there just appears to be some intrinsic issues associated with the fact that, for example, people are not going to ASCO. And it's not like this is the first year that you've had your cancer advocacy, cancer organizations and advocacy has been going on for years and years and decades. So I'm curious, and again, not wanting to get too political, about what you think the complacency, the not caring, I'm too overwhelmed, I don't have the money. What is intrinsically in the kind of Canadian organization infrastructure development that creates this environment where people just don't have to be as innovative as perhaps they might be in the US or in Europe?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I ask that a lot too. And I asked that when we were working on CAR-T in the initial stages, because with CAR-T, we really had that opportunity to show leadership in the implementation of this, incredible disruptive technology. And, just as an example with CAR T, we did such a great job at the beginning of, regulators working with HTA working with HTA. So, Ines and Kadith, who, without being political, had never worked together. And with CAR T, they were actually working together. And, one of my colleagues said this about, for the first time, we have one country, it's not Quebec and the rest of Canada, it's one country working together on this file. And we had HTA working with the patient advocates, we had HTA working with the healthcare professionals, we had patient groups working with the patient groups. So it was really an opportunity for leadership. And then after it was reviewed and it went to, and actually it didn't go to PCPA, it followed a different format, which I can't remember at the moment. And then it really fell through the cracks. And then it was months and months and months before we actually saw application of CAR T in hospital. And can you imagine, like the clinical sites who are all set up, the doctors who are ready to give the CAR T and they can't because there's this barrier that's related to funding. So I think we do a really great job of dismantling innovation because of funding and because of budgets. And, I don't really know why that is. In the UK, they did such a wonderful job with introducing CAR T into the clinical sites. And Canada follows a very similar model to the UK model with the HTA and the reimbursement and the, universal healthcare where the government is paying for it. So I don't understand why we have this complacency and this mediocrity when it comes to innovation. But I do think, though, that with COVID, we had this, we can't do telehealth, we can't do manufacturing and research and development in Canada. We had this cannot do mindset. And then that really shifted to a more of like, we must do manufacturing and research and development in Canada. So I'm hoping that that COVID experience will translate into cancer and into health and help us sort of change that environment.
I am very hopeful with you as well, too. I think the other thing that sent shivers up many people's backs is really, I think in some ways, the impact that we've heard about. All you really heard was there was a net number of, for example, using the example of COVID, the net number of people that were being infected and the hospitalizations, there was a net number. It wasn't necessarily being compared to other countries, but all you heard through that noise was just the inundation of ICUs. And so I think that really speaks to ultimately in the bigger picture, the amount of funding that actually happens in the healthcare industry. So this is really the voice that's speaking out, is we don't have enough money that's being infiltrated for healthcare. And I'm hoping with you for cancer, cardiovascular, metabolic, rare diseases, that those voices are going to be heard. So I think this is actually a good positive way to end the dialogue. Certainly we could be speaking for hours. The work that you're doing is going to be endless in optimism and opportunity. And I think you're only just excavating and starting that. You're just at the precipice of really a meaningful movement. Anybody who's listening to the show and you're interested in contacting Sabrina Hanna from the Cancer Collaborative, how your organization, your team, your company might be able to work to build advocacy, to start moving some of these policies forward, we invite you to take a look at her contact information. We'll be leaving those in the show notes. We also encourage you to check out impetusdigital.com. This is precisely the kinds of conversations that we spearhead in our asynchronous and synchronous virtual touch points, bringing payers, patients, allied healthcare providers, physicians together to move these agendas, these policies, these ideas forward so that we can start to positively move healthcare decision-making forward. We want to thank everybody for their time today. We'd really appreciate if you can like and subscribe to our channel. And we would really love if you could leave us a review on iTunes. We want to thank you for your time today. Thank you, Sabrina, for an excellent conversation. and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.